Drive 20 minutes from the Port of Baltimore and you are in Dundalk, where entire row house blocks sit half empty, where demolition crews work streets that were built to hold thousands of steelworkers, where the infrastructure of a functioning neighborhood remains intact around properties that have been vacant for 30 years. Drive back toward the water and you pass the Inner Harbor, hotels, a convention center, a waterfront aquarium that draws 1.5 million visitors a year. These two geographies exist inside the same city limits, separated by less than 10 miles, connected by the same municipal budget and the same failing school system. One of them looks like a city that worked, the other looks like a city that was abandoned. Both of them are Baltimore. Baltimore has one of the finest natural harbors on the Eastern Seaboard. It sits 40 miles northeast of Washington, D.C., and 90 miles southwest of Philadelphia, the midpoint of the most economically dense corridor in the United States. It was the point of origin for the first commercial railroad in American history. Its port handles over 50 million tons of cargo annually. Almost every distressed American city can point to a geographic disadvantage that explains its decline: a port that's silted up, a resource that ran out, a railroad that bypassed it. Baltimore cannot make that argument. The harbor is still deep, the port is still operating. The railroad still runs. Baltimore is not failing because its geography stopped working. It is failing because 70 years of deliberate decisions were layered on top of a geographic foundation that could have supported an entirely different outcome. Baltimore sits at the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay, where the Patapsco River opens into a natural deepwater harbor that requires minimal dredging to accommodate modern container shipping. New York Harbor, the dominant East Coast port, spends hundreds of millions of dollars annually maintaining the artificial depth its geography does not naturally provide. Baltimore's harbor provides it for free. The Port of Baltimore handles approximately 52 million tons of cargo annually, generates an estimated $26 billion in economic activity, and supports approximately 140,000 regional jobs. It is one of the busiest ports on the Eastern Seaboard, and it has been continuously operational since the 18th century. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1827, was the first commercial railroad in the United States. It was not a federal infrastructure project or a visionary act of public planning. It was a competitive response. Baltimore merchants needed to move goods from the continental interior to their harbor faster than the Erie Canal was moving goods to New York, and they built the railroad to do it. The geographic logic was direct. Baltimore had a better harbor than New York. It had a shorter route to the interior, and it needed a faster mechanism than a canal to exploit both advantages. By the mid-19th century, Baltimore was the second largest city in the United States, a ranking that reflected genuine geographic and commercial dominance, not administrative accident. Most American cities that have declined significantly can identify the moment their geographic advantage disappeared. The river that was bypassed by the railroad, the resource that was depleted, the route that was rerouted. Baltimore's geographic advantage has not disappeared. The port still ranks among the top ports on the Eastern Seaboard by cargo tonnage. The harbor is still deep. The Interstate 95 corridor still runs through it. The decline is not geographic. It is everything built on top of the geography. At its peak, the Bethlehem Steel Plant at Sparrows Point, on a peninsula jutting into the Chesapeake Bay southeast of the city, was the largest steel mill on Earth. It employed approximately 35,000 workers at its World War II maximum. It produced the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, and the hulls of Navy destroyers. Entire communities were built specifically to house its workforce. Dundalk, Edgemere, Essex, row house blocks, and corner stores and school systems scaled to the employment footprint of a single industrial facility. Bethlehem Steel declared bankruptcy in 2001. The Sparrows Point plant was sold repeatedly and finally ceased steel production in 2012. The physical plant, 3,100 acres of industrial land on the Chesapeake, sat idle for years, its infrastructure too contaminated and too specialized for conventional redevelopment. The communities built around it did not close with the mill. They remained with their infrastructure intact and their economic foundation gone. Most American cities that experienced de-industrialization lost factories distributed across their industrial districts, damaging but dispersed. Pittsburgh lost steel mills along river corridors that could eventually be converted to parks and research campuses. Detroit lost auto plants that were geographically separated from residential neighborhoods. Baltimore lost a single facility that had structured the employment, housing, and community identity of an entire quadrant of the metropolitan area. The scale of Sparrows Point made it a city within a city while it operated. When it closed, it left a crater the size of a city, 3,100 contaminated acres on the Chesapeake, that Baltimore has spent over a decade trying to figure out what to do with, surrounded by communities that have been waiting just as long for an answer. In the early 1980s, Baltimore's Inner Harbor was an abandoned industrial waterfront, derelict piers, vacant warehouses, contaminated land at the geographic center of the city. The redevelopment that followed, anchored by the opening of Harbor Place in 1980 and the National Aquarium in 1981, became the most imitated urban waterfront project in American history. Boston's Faneuil Hall, New York's South Street Seaport, and dozens of mid-sized American city waterfront projects through the 1980s and 1990s directly copied the model. Convert derelict industrial waterfront into retail, dining, and cultural attractions, and use the resulting tourism economy to signal urban revival. The Inner Harbor worked as a tourism product. It generated foot traffic, hotel occupancy, and convention business. It gave Baltimore a skyline image that could appear in national magazines without showing what was 2 miles behind it. What it did not do was connect its economic activity to the residential city surrounding it. The jobs the Inner Harbor created were hospitality and retail, low-wage, part-time, without the stability or benefits that the manufacturing jobs they nominally replaced had provided. The tax revenue it generated did not flow back into the neighborhoods experiencing the steepest decline. The Inner Harbor became in practice a prosperous enclave bordered by some of the most distressed residential geography in the American Northeast. Every city that copied it copied the aesthetic. None of them solved the disconnection problem Baltimore never solved either. Harbor Place filed for bankruptcy in 2024, a closing signal that the festival marketplace retail model it pioneered could not survive the structural shifts in consumer behavior that the neighborhoods around it had been surviving for 40 years. Baltimore is one of the most extensively studied cities in the United States for the mechanics of racially motivated housing policy. The Homeowners Loan Corporation maps produced in 1937 graded the city's neighborhoods on a 4-tier scale, systematically applying the D-grade hazardous designation to Black populated areas regardless of their physical condition or income levels. Federal Housing Administration, mortgage insurance, the financing mechanism that built the post-war American middle class, was routinely denied for properties in those D-grade areas, concentrating private mortgage capital in white suburban neighborhoods and starving urban Black neighborhoods of the investment vehicle that built generational wealth in the post-war era. Highway construction reinforced this geography with concrete. Interstate 83 and the network of arterial roads built through Baltimore in the 1950s and the 1960s were routed through Black neighborhoods, not through the wealthier white neighborhoods that had the political power to redirect the alignment. The construction displaced an estimated 25,000 residents. The public housing high-rises built in the same period, the Poe homes, the Murphy homes, the Lafayette courts, concentrated poverty in specific geographic corridors rather than distributing it across the city. When those towers were demolished in the 1990s and the 2000s, their residents were dispersed into adjacent neighborhoods rather than integrated into the broader city. Baltimore's poverty geography is not an accident of market sorting. It is the accumulated output of specific decisions made by identifiable institutions documented in surviving records. The neighborhoods that declined most severely are not the neighborhoods furthest from the harbor or the railroad or the interstate. They are the neighborhoods that policy specifically prevented from accumulating wealth during the exact decades when wealth accumulation was most accessible to everyone else. That is not a coincidence. it is a result. Baltimore contains an estimated 15,000 vacant properties distributed throughout residential neighborhoods built for continuous, unbroken occupation. The row house, Baltimore's dominant building type, was engineered for density with shared party walls, minimal setbacks, and street-fronting facades designed to create active pedestrian environments. It is the same building type that defines Philadelphia's vacancy crisis, and it fails the same way. A single abandoned row house on a block compromises the structural integrity of its attached neighbors. Shared party walls mean water damage spreads laterally. Collapsed roofs expose adjacent structures. Pest infestation migrates through connected basements. One vacant row house eliminates the street activation the building type requires to function. It depresses the assessed value of every property touching it. Reduced values reduce the tax revenue from that block. Reduced revenue reduces the municipal budget available to address the vacancy. The problem generates the conditions that prevent the solution. The city has been demolishing vacant structures at significant scale, approximately 5,000 structures from 2015 to 2022, at an average cost of $15,000 to $25,000 per structure. The demolition rate has not kept pace with the abandonment rate. Cleared lots produce what planners call the checkerboard effect, gaps in otherwise continuous row house blocks that eliminate the structural and social continuity the building type requires to function. In some cases, demolition has made blocks less functional rather than more by removing the attached wall support and street front activation the remaining structures depend on. The vacancy crisis is not a housing problem in isolation. It is a fiscal problem, a public safety problem, and a structural engineering problem, all produced simultaneously by the same abandoned building and compounding each other on the same block. Detroit's collapse is legible. General Motors contracted, the auto industry left, and the tax base followed. The geography that built Detroit, flat industrial land near Great Lakes shipping, stopped being the decisive advantage when the product it was built to manufacture stopped being made there. Baltimore's geography has not stopped working. The harbor is still deep, the port still moves cargo, the railroad still connects it to the continental interior. The Interstate 95 corridor still passes through it. The Chesapeake Bay is still one of the finest natural harbor systems on the Eastern Seaboard. Baltimore did not fail because its geographic advantages disappeared. It failed because the policy decisions layered on top of those advantages, the redlining, the highway routing, the housing concentration, the waterfront redevelopment that served tourists while the surrounding city declined, systematically prevented half its population from accessing the prosperity those advantages could have generated. The port works. The city around it doesn't. That gap between what the geography offered and what the policy delivered is the most precise definition of how a city can be built wrong. Most failing American cities failed because the thing that built them stopped. Baltimore is failing while the thing that built it keeps running. The ships still come in, the cranes still move. The container terminals at Dundalk and Seagirt operate around the clock. The harbor that made Baltimore the second largest city in America is still there, doing exactly what it has always done. The city wrapped around it is a different story, and the distance between those two facts is not a mystery. It is a record.